Hello, dear colleagues and friends. Welcome back to the IDEP online training on land governance in support of agricultural transformation in Africa. Well, we are now starting module 3, which is about best practices in land policy development, implementation, and monitoring. This is a very important topic as well. Take note of the one segment of the title, best practices. Best practices, because we are not here to say that there is a model land policy or model implementation system. We are just drawing from the best practices across the continent. So there's no model land policy as such. Also remember that we just completed module 2. Module 2 was about key land issues in Africa. What we tried to do in module 2 was to let you know that yes, Africa is a very big, very large continent with a lot of diversity, but anyway, we are aware that there are communalities. So African countries will share different land issues. So it's a good basis for learning from each other. At the same time, we also acknowledge that there are regional specificities. That's where we are coming. And now we are going toward talking about best practices in land policy development and implementation. Let's start with the module objectives and expected outcomes. The objective of this module is to raise awareness about the importance of land policy and reform. 1. 2, it's to share lessons learned from best practices in land policy development implementation in Africa. And 3, to provide a basis to reflect on monitoring and evaluation of land governance in Africa. You have now the outline of this course, of this module. 1, conceptualizing land policy. What is land policy? What are we talking about when it comes to land policy? 2, land policy development. How do we develop sound land policies? 3, land policy implementation. Developing a land policy is not the end of the story. You need to implement it if the people are to benefit the land policy. So, what are the key elements of good land policy implementation? And then 4, monitoring and evaluation of land policy. This is very important as well. We can have a land policy, we can be implementing the land policy, but at the same time, we need to implement such a land policy. So let me go straight and start with conceptualizing land policy. So the question is, what are we talking about when we are addressing the issue of land policy? Recently, African governments have shown strong interest to land policy development and implementation. When it comes to land policy development, we can just note that up to now, African countries have made a lot of efforts to make land reform, revise their land laws and so on. But they had very limited success on the ground. Achieved in land policy in Africa. Recently, African governments have shown strong interest in land policy development and implementation. It's important to recognize that African governments made efforts to develop their land reforms through mainly revising and updating their land laws and other initiatives. However, we can note that there were limited success on the ground. One of the reasons of so limited success in land policy is that most countries for sure have national land laws, but they didn't have national land policy. So this is a huge gap in terms of instruments needed to really implement land policies on the ground and guide the implementation of land policies on the ground. However, we noted significant progress since the years 2000. Let me highlight few examples of land policy developments across Africa. Recent developments. In Niger, this country has just developed a draft land policy. This draft land policy is now tabled for adoption. It has recently been discussed during a government seminar which made recommendations for revisions. In Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo is now in the process of finalizing the drafting of their national land policy. What I can tell you is that the national committee in charge of developing the land policy is now gathering feedback from different experts across Africa about the draft land policy. I can say that in Eastern Africa, in Rwanda, the national land policy of 2004 was recently reviewed and aligned with the country national strategy for transformation. So good development. In Southern Africa, I would mention that Botswana recently amended its 2005 land policy with a view to strengthening the rights of women on land. And in Northern Africa, Morocco officially launched a land policy process in 2017 and is preparing a national land policy and implementation plan. So you can see that across the continent, things are moving. Why are things moving since this last decade? I would really highlight the instrumental role played by the ALPC, the African Land Policy Center, which was previously called the Land Policy Initiative. Remember that the LPI, the Land Policy Initiative, started as a joint initiative of the African Union, the Economic Commission for Africa, and the African Development Bank. Now it's organized as the African Land Policy Center. Since its establishment, the LPI, then now ALPC, advocated strongly for land policy development across the continent. This is the Pan-African Initiative on Land Governance. I would say that this is the first Pan-African initiative on land issues in Africa. Let's also remember that the LPI and now ALPC has initiated studies across the continent, regional consultations, on land policy issues and land governance. The ALPC has also facilitated the adoption of key commitments on land policy at the level of the African Union. Let me mention, for example, the African Declaration on Land, the Nairobi Action Plan on Large-Scale Land-Based Investments, and the 30% commitment on women's land rights by 2030. The ALPC also developed tools in support of land policy implementation. And it also initiated a very important network, which is the NELGA, the Network of Excellence on Land Governance in Africa. And this platform is about sustaining and improving capacity development in land governance through developing curricula at the level of universities. And you also know that the ALPC is convening periodic platform on issues of land governance. This is, for example, the conference, the African Conference on Land Governance, which is taking place every 2 years. So you have the link to the ALPC website in case you need to go and have a closer look at what is going on. So let's be back now to the concept of land policy. I'll just take a definition by the Framework and Guidelines on Land Policy in Africa, the AU Framework and Guidelines on Land Policy. So, land policy is considered as a set of agreed principles to govern ownership or access to, use and management of land resources to enhance their productivity and contribute to social, economic, political, and environmental development and poverty alleviation. So this is a set, land policy is a set of principles to govern different aspects, different dimensions of the governance of land. It might be interesting to make clear distinction between land policies and land laws. Most people just consider, mainly at country level, that while we have a land policy for sure because we have a land law. No, a land policy is different from a land law. Land law will determine the different rights on land. They will define the different rights on land. They will define also the regime related, the legal regime related to the land, to the land rights, and also the procedures which are applicable to those land rights. Land policies would rather provide strategic guidance to decision makers on how land can serve national development. Remember, we said that land policies are a set of principles. So those principles will provide strategic guidance to the decision makers on how to make land serve national development. Another aspect we can use to make a distinction between land policies and land laws is that land laws are tools which are used primarily by government administration to administer land, and also by courts to settle land disputes. While land policies are tools which are used by decision makers to guide public action in the land sector. What I want to also insist on is that citizens can make very important use of land policies in the context of land policy dialogues, national land policy dialogue, and also to hold government accountable about land governance. A third aspect of distinction we can use between land laws and land policy. Land laws are usually technical documents which are usually accessible mainly by legal experts and land administration experts. However, land policy documents are usually accessible to the normal citizens, to the policymakers. As such, they provide a basis for informing national policy dialogues on land. There is no uniform way of developing land policies. There are variations on land policy processes. African countries implement different approaches to land policy. Some countries never reviewed nor revised their land policy or land law since independence. Other countries made significant reform to their land laws, but never developed a land policy. So they have made revision to their land laws, but they never developed a land policy. A third category of countries are those who developed a land policy first, then undertook a reform of the land law accordingly. So they will develop a national land policy, then they will adjust the land law according to the principles of the policy. But you also have countries who developed a framework land law first, then developed a national land policy. So they had a framework land law, but they realized that they needed a national land policy. So they went backward and developed again the land policy and then tried to adjust the land law accordingly. What we can say is that the best practice is to develop the policy, then to draft or adjust the land law accordingly. That's really the best practice. But African countries have different contexts, different history, and they will just come to land policy in different ways. Let's also notice that there is a diversity of denomination. In some instances, you'll hear that it's called national land policy of such country. In other countries, you'll hear talking about a white paper on land policy or a paper on land policy. In other countries, you'll hear about a declaration on land policy. And other countries use the terminology of land policy letter. This is common in many African countries. Many Francophone countries, sorry. There are also a diversity of formats. Some countries decide to develop a single comprehensive policy document, but others will target the development of different thematic policy documents. For example, a rural land policy, an urban land policy, land rights policy, land use policy, and others. So the approach can be different. Let me also mention that the modalities of adoption varies across the continent. In some countries, the land policy principles are embedded in the constitution. For other countries, there is a formal adoption of the policy by law, meaning by the parliament. For other countries, the adoption is done by cabinet through a decree or ordinance. But you also find countries who just had an informal adoption of the policy through a consultative process, meaning a national validation forum, for example. So the adoption modality varies according to the country needs, experience, and history. Here you have a table with the status of land policy development across the continent. It might not be comprehensive, but it gives a quite good picture of where we are now with land policy development. You have the different columns here, the country, the year of adoption of the national land policy, the title of the document, a column for observations, and a column, very important, with the links to the policy document itself. You can go through the table and have a look. You can check if your country is mentioned, if the references are right, or if we forgot your country. This can happen also. As I said, this is not a comprehensive table. So continue having a look at the different countries which are considered. Again, what you can also notice is that most land policies were adopted, as we said, after the years 2000. Countries who developed their national land policy before the years 2000, I think, are Ghana and Mozambique. They had their land policy before the years 2000, but really most countries developed their land policy after the year 2000. Some countries have not adopted yet, but are on the process of developing and getting their land policy adopted. Let me mention Niger, the DRC, Morocco, Senegal, Mauritania. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. You can check if your country is now in the process of developing its land policy. And you can go to the forum and post and share information with other participants. Let me go now to land policy development. What are the best practices in land policy development? We need to understand first that land policy development is a very complex process. The process is challenging because of different elements. First, remember that we said that land policy and governance is at the converging point of different disciplines. This was module 1. But we also need to acknowledge that land is at the convergent point of different conflicting interests. You have interests of local communities, which might be different from the interests of the private sector, which might be different from the interest of government or the interest of local governments. So how do you balance those different conflicting interests? It's a real challenge for those who are leading land policy development processes. Another aspect is that land reform in general is a change process. You will change the way land is owned, the way land is accessed, the way land is administered, the way land is used, and other. Meaning that in the change process, some will win, while others might lose. Therefore, you need to always anticipate resistance to any land reform process. If the land reform is favorable to local communities, you might have the private sector complaining and resisting, or the government also complaining because it makes access to land more difficult than the time when it was, for example, state sovereignty over land, etc. So in any change process, you have winners and losers. So the challenge for a land policy development process is to really balance those who are losing, those who are winning, and get a kind of consensus, a kind of shared consensus among stakeholders. Minimum consensus, I would say, among stakeholders. So balancing key interests is a major challenge. Balancing those interests while maintaining the pro-poor objective of the land policy development process. It's important to really insist on the fact that land policies in Africa need to be pro-poor, because the majority of the population in Africa, let's say around 80% of the population, is poor and rely on access and use of land for their livelihood. So any land policy in Africa should take into consideration the rights and interests of the majority of the people, meaning the poor. The majority are the poor. So land policies in Africa need to be pro-poor policy, not just addressing the interests of the elites. We also need to understand that land policy processes are costly and time-consuming. Let's talk about time. A significant amount of time is required to adequately develop a land policy. You need to gather data, you need to go through popular consultations, you need to consult and get feedback from different stakeholders and so on. So it really requires a lot of time. Usually it will take several years to develop a land policy from the starting point to the adoption of the policy. I would say that it can take minimum 1, 2, sometimes 3 years to develop a sound land policy. This doesn't mean that if you doesn't take sufficient time, the policy is not good. It just means that you need to allocate the required time to what needs to be done. You need to consult, you need to gather data, to document, and so on. So it's clearly taking time. The time needed for land policy development might conflict with the political agenda of decision makers. You know that decision makers sometimes need to go to, periodically I would say, need to go to elections and they need to show that they did this and this for the people, including developing a land policy. If the government has promised that by such time they will provide a land policy, a proper land policy, and then those in charge of developing the land policy are taking time, it might bring conflicts between the experts and the policy makers and decision makers. So I think we already said that consultation and participation is costly, but we need to really question the cost effectiveness of land policy development processes. Why are consultations and participation so costly? So this is a question, maybe a question for monitoring and evaluation land policy processes. However, what is important to keep in mind is that land policy development, sound land policy development, comprehensive land policy development, holistic land policy development is achievable. Many countries developed their land policy document within a reasonable time frame, so that's possible. And what is important also to acknowledge is that political will and support to the land policy process help to fast track the process. So this is a very complex process. How can the land policy development process be initiated? This will depend on the national context, meaning that it's not always easy to start a land policy process if the context, the national context, is not favorable. For example, if you are in a country with a lot of political instability or a major conflict, it's difficult to talk about land policy development and land policy reform. It's not impossible, but it can make things more difficult. So land reform is part of the national political agenda. Sometimes the decision makers, the policy makers have no choice than developing a land policy or developing a land reform. This is the case, for example, in South Africa. South Africa today, the land reform issue is really critical, and I would say that the government has no choice than going clearly toward a land reform which is acceptable by the majority of the people. Sometimes CSOs make advocacy campaigns which are very effective and very successful and brings the government to develop a land policy. This is the case, for example, in Burkina Faso, where CSOs have been instrumental in pushing the land policy agenda. I would also mention Senegal, where the farmers' organizations have been really successful in pushing the land policy agenda, although the land policy has not been developed yet. We all know also that Mozambique has been, in Mozambique, the CSOs played a very important role in pushing the land policy agenda. In some other cases, the political will is really critical to developing the land policy process. For example, the land policy process in DRC started when the president, the former president, decided that land policy is a major issue for the country, and he needs a land policy to be developed to guide public action. In Rwanda, for example, the government, after the genocide, understood that land was one of the root cause of the conflict and decided that it needs a land policy and land reform. So the political will was so important in the Rwanda land policy process. In some other countries, the land policy process started with a recommendation by a technical commission set by the government. This was the case for the land policy of Ghana, for example. In some other countries, the land policy process was spearheaded by development partners. So the national context is very important, and in any national context, you need an opportunity window in order to develop, to launch a land policy process. The leadership of the land policy process will depend on the specific country context and also on the specific institutional setting of that country. We all call for participation of the people, of non-state actors, but we need to all recognize that government is in the driving seat when it comes to land policy process. So participation is key, but let's also recognize that the land policy is led by the government. Any land policy process need to be developed through an intersectoral approach. You always have a lead ministry. Sometimes it's the Ministry of Agriculture. Sometimes it can be a specific ministry in charge of land. In most Francophone countries, it's the Ministry of Finance, which is in charge of land. And other countries, the Ministry of Urban Development is the lead in land policy. But the lead ministry needs to always discuss, interact with other ministries which are concerned by land. If, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture is in charge of land issues, it needs to discuss with the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Urban Development, and others. So the intersectoral approach is really key, because you don't have any sector which doesn't need or which doesn't use land. So you need to make a clear distinction between the leadership of the land reform and the need for use of the land by other sectors. Most countries establish an interministerial committee to steer the process. So this is a common setting, institutional setting in land reform. Let me highlight one very important thing. It's about communication. From the start of the land policy process, communication needs to be considered as critical. The moment the land policy is starting, communication strategies need to be put in place and target the key stakeholders. So communication is really critical for a successful land policy process. We'll be back to this later. One best practice is that it's good for a high-level personality to chair the official launch of the land policy. This can be, for example, the president chairing physically, for example, the land policy process, or just sending the prime minister with a message of the president to be delivered to the launching event. It can be also a prominent personality within the country, a member of the parliament, president of the parliament, for example, and any really, I would say, VIP, which can be considered later as a kind of champion for the land policy process. So it's part of what I would say is part of communication as well as part of showing that there is political will behind the land policy process.